Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. We're delighted to have you here at our kickoff keynote with Dr. Joshua Eyler for our third Faculty Development Summit and our first virtual one, all virtual. So I just wanted to kick off with some housekeeping. Just a reminder that there's a number of panels coming up throughout the coming week. We hope you'll get to some of them. Registration is ongoing. You'll be receiving a daily email with information of the day's panels, and so you can register at any time. And do remember, we also have meetups with your fellow program faculty, so please get to those if you get the chance. We also have a hashtag, which please feel free to talk about the summit, hashtag AAP Summit. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dean Veronica Donoghue to introduce the summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I just want to say welcome. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday. Welcome to the third annual AAP Faculty Summit, as Sarah mentioned. Each year, the summit is very important to us at AAP. It provides us an opportunity at AAP for all of us in the field of teaching, all of us who are working on teaching and learning, to come together as a community of experts, to come together as a community of teachers, and also to come together as people who are engaged in lifelong learning. In these summits, we share our insights. We share our insights in teaching online. We share our insights into each other's courses and classes, and many times, sometimes we share war stories about the art and science of teaching and learning. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great deal of opportunities throughout the week for you to join various sessions and panels hosted by our faculty. Please join us throughout the week as we engage in our practice of teaching. I do have the pleasure today of introducing our keynote speaker, Joshua Eiler. At the University of Mississippi, Josh has a leadership role in faculty development and is also the director of Think Forward, Quality Enhancement, and a plan there for academics. He holds a faculty position in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric. He also holds a PhD in Medieval Studies from the University of Connecticut. Josh previously worked on teaching and learning initiatives at Columbia State University, George Mason University, and Rice University. His research interests include evidence-based pedagogy, disability studies, and he is also the author of the book we gave out last year, How Humans Learn, the Science and Stories Behind Effective College Teaching. Josh, we're very glad to have him here today. He's going to speak about resilient pedagogy, making our courses more flexible, adaptable, and resistant to disruption, something we're all very familiar with. However, true resilient pedagogy is an emerging model for teaching in times of disruption. Over the past few months, educators at various institutions have come together to work and to develop this framework or this model. The goal of resilient pedagogy is to develop course materials and learning experiences that are resistant as possible to disruption and to changes in the learning environment that happen as a result of disruption. Today, Josh will explore this framework and provide participants with opportunities to think about how they might use this model in future courses. Please join me in welcoming Josh Eiler. Thank you. Josh?
Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation, Tammy. I'm delighted to be here today to kick off your event, to talk a little bit about resilient pedagogy. So yes, I'm currently at the University of Mississippi. I've been there for just over a year now, and so it was quite a year to kick things off, and that's part of what I want to talk about today. As you all know, in March, higher education had to take on one of the biggest challenges it's ever encountered. And that was, of course, moving an entire enterprise online and remote. And the real challenge at the heart of that was, how do we build a kind of triage emergency model to make sure that the work of learning and the student experience had continuity to it, and to make that experience as solid and as meaningful as possible for them. But then the spring semester ended. And I may not be alone in this feeling, but it was sort of like being on a rowboat in the ocean and having made it over one big wave and turning around and seeing a tidal wave coming behind you. Because once the spring ended, a new challenge, perhaps just as big, emerged on the horizon. And that had to do with what can we learn from our students and our faculty about what went well and what could be improved from the spring? And then importantly, how can we take that information and help to prepare faculty for the work that they'll be doing in the fall? And we had a group at the University of Mississippi that came together from faculty development, instructional design, IT, and some other places, and some faculty joined that group as well. It's called Keep Teaching, and we were charged with the provost, or by the provost, with doing that work, helping to prepare our faculty. So that was the next big challenge. What is the fall going to look like, and how can we possibly provide a framework for faculty so that they can plan to successfully help their students to learn regardless of what modality they would be in. So I kind of went and scoured the literature and the conversations on social media and in other forums where teaching and learning professionals get together to try and find a way of providing some kind of foundation for that work. And one of the things that I saw emerging fairly early on in the spring, maybe March or April, was something that was being referred to as resilient pedagogy. I hadn't heard of it before. I mean, resilience is obviously a pretty common idea, but how it's being used here, something we'll talk about over the course of our time together today, is very specific to a theoretical model that seeks to build courses, assignments, activities, etc., that are as resistant to change as possible. And we're gonna, today, what I hope to do is to give a little bit of background about what resilient pedagogy is, give some examples about regarding what it might look like, give you all some opportunities to think through the beginning phases of the process of designing for resiliency, and then also address what I think is a related and really important issue, and that is once we can zero in on a framework, once we decide that yes, a resilient model is kind of the way to go, how did we at the University of Mississippi scale that programming so that it reached as many faculty as possible? Because that's the other side of this equation. It's one thing to prioritize a particular approach to the work that a university would be doing moving forward. But it's another thing to put together programming to give access to as many faculty as possible to that particular approach. So I want to end today's session by talking about how we did that and how we might think about faculty development programming systemically in perhaps new ways that this pandemic world is kind of moving us toward in terms of effective models for helping faculty acquire the information, tools, models, and frameworks that they need to help their students learn successfully. So that's kind of the lay of the land for today. I do want to note one thing on the title slide here. I have my email address and my Twitter handle. Please do feel free at any point to reach out to me to ask questions about today's presentation or just to continue the conversation. I think that that's always an important aspect of a presentation like this. So, what is resilient pedagogy? As I said, it's new, it is emerging, and I think you can see the nature of an emerging theoretical model in the differences in the way people talk about it and the way it's being deployed at certain universities. So what I have here is a definition that the University of Michigan was using to govern its use of resilient pedagogy. And part of the programming that their academic innovation group put together was a MOOC on resilient teaching that launched on Coursera in early June. And what I want to highlight here, I'm not going to read the definition to you, but I want to highlight kind of about halfway through that the approach to resilient pedagogy takes into account a dynamic learning context. And I want to highlight that because it's that dynamism that really is the framing of resilient pedagogy. And what I mean by that is simply, we are in a world of constant change now. And how can we adapt our pedagogical models, our teaching models, to address that change? You know, higher ed, by and large, historically, is kind of governed by inertia in many ways, and that not a resistance to change, but a slow process of change. And so the accelerated change that we're seeing right now is new for us. And that requires us to make quick adaptations of our models in order to account for that change. So that dynamic context is really important, as is what comes after it here in the passage, that they may require new forms of interactions between teacher-student content and tools. And these are things that we're going to really talk about over the course of the next hour or so. How do we adapt to that? What might those new interactions look like? And to what extent are they rooted in the interactions that we find valuable or found valuable in the context in which we taught previously? So it's all kind of interconnected, and in its roots, or it's rooted in a way of understanding teaching and learning in a changing world, and how can we address that? So resilient, this model, again, emerging model, has roots in different disciplines like architecture and environmental studies that have focused on resiliency for a long time. And what those disciplines obviously are articulating when they think about resiliency, how can we design houses or other kinds of environments, other kinds of organizations that are as resistant to change and as flexible as possible, adaptable as possible. So what I have here are two photos. As Veronica noted, before I came to the University of Mississippi, I was at Rice University for 6 years. Where I led their teaching center. And in 2017, those of us living in Houston, in late August of that year, we heard a weather report that there was a storm brewing in the Gulf. That storm turned out to be Hurricane Harvey, one of the most destructive hurricanes ever to hit Houston. And what you see on the left-hand side of your screen is a photo that my wife took from a neighborhood very close to where we live in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. And actually, when you drove around Houston in late August, early September, this was the sight that you saw everywhere. Lots of debris from houses that had been flooded and had to be scrapped on the side of the road. And so this was the situation in the immediate aftermath. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen is a house from that same neighborhood that has just been finished, but has been designed and built with resiliency in mind. You'll notice that the house is about 7 feet off the ground, and that this is, and there are other elements of the design and architecture that are meant to be, to withstand the kind of changes in the environment and in the climate as much as possible, right? To withstand that as much as possible. So it's raised off the ground. Other aspects of its construction are resilient in nature as well. So this is the way architects are approaching this in this neighborhood, this area of Houston. And I'm using it here as an analogy. What you see on the left is what happened to many of our courses and our programs in March. What we're trying to do is build classes activities, assignments, etc., that look more like the photo on the right, as resilient to change as possible. And the resilient pedagogy framework gives us insight and tools as to how we might do that work. But in reality, what's happening now, and in the transition from March into the summer as we prepared for the fall, really, because this has never happened before, we are a lot like these fellows. This is a scene from the famous movie Apollo 13. This is when the astronauts have communicated to the Houston Command that their carbon dioxide filter is failing. And the folks on the ground have to figure out how to take what is currently in the module with the astronauts and design a new filter for them. And so it's a really famous scene where they're all wondering, okay, well, how are we going to do this? And the answer is we had to take what is available to us. They had to take what is available to them and design something that would work. And I think that, given what I was just talking about, given the moment that we are in, we're very much like this. We have to take the components that we have available to us, and that is the technology, the learning environments, the methods and tools of effective teaching, and the content that shapes our disciplines and our individual courses. We have to take those and design something that will work for our students, given the parameters and the limitations within which we are working. And so I've sort of spent the summer comparing our work constantly to this particular scene, because it feels very new and in some ways very intimidating to say, okay, well, we have to make something that will be meaningful for student learning from the components that we have available to us. For many faculty across the country, this is very new. Teaching either synchronously online, asynchronously, or even hybrid. That's a new modality for many faculty. And so not only was it a shift in the way we communicate with students, but a shift overall in the way we approach our teaching activities. And so that's part of, I think, what is really driving us toward resilient pedagogy, at least the way we framed it at our university, because what we're interested in is capturing what faculty found to be valuable and meaningful in their interactions and their teaching before this happened, and being able to utilize those and make them meaningful in new contexts. So I'll talk a little bit about that over the next few minutes. This is the way that we have defined resilient pedagogy at the University of Mississippi. We've sort of put a little bit of a different spin on it. And here we get more into the definition. What do we mean by designing with resiliency in mind? So the way we've kind of conceptualized it is with this equation, that resilient pedagogy equals resilient course design plus resilient students plus resilient faculty. And resilient course design is what we've sort of been talking about for the last few minutes. Courses that are as resistant as possible to disruption and change in the learning environment as possible. Now, how we do that is another matter that I'm going to get to in a few minutes. Resilient students need us to pay attention to the inequities that are magnified by the crisis. And so, in other words, this is not something that students should feel that they are entirely and solely responsible for. In fact, the term resiliency often gets criticized for being almost emerging from almost a deficit model, or being seen as just do this, like just persevere, just be resilient without any tools to do that. But that's not where we're coming from with this. It's not where I'm coming from with the resilient model. Students need us to help them do this. And paying attention to the inequities magnified by the crisis is one of the most important elements of this. Some examples of that, certainly things that were highlighted were the accessibility, issues of technology and access to that technology, access to Wi-Fi to do the work. These are inequities that were magnified by the crisis. Not even to mention, some of the structural inequities in higher ed that already exist and were magnified by what happened in March. Students also need preparation for how to succeed in online courses. I know in your program you have a ton of online courses anyway, and so this is something that I know you're always thinking about. But this is something that I think across the board in American higher education that we need to think more about how to help them succeed in online courses. The literature on online learning shows really clearly that the students who do the best in online courses, or succeed at a higher rate anyway, are those who are already self-motivated and self-driven to learn. And so often those students are drawn to online courses because their own strategies for learning align with sort of the goals of online learning. However, many students in March found themselves in a position where they had signed up for face-to-face classes and were suddenly in an online learning environment, and that was causing a couple of things. It was causing a discrepancy between the way many students feel comfortable learning and used to learning, and how they were then the environment they were then placed in to do that learning. So, but also the modes by which they were used to learning, like being in class, being able to turn to the person next to you and say, "Did you catch that?" Or asking a real-time question to the faculty member. Those were different as well, and so students had to adjust on all fronts. The way the other thing I think that research shows, the way we help students who are struggling in online classes then is to have more avenues, more opportunities, more workshops for students to learn how to learn in online courses. And I think we need to pay really close attention to that kind of systemically as we move forward. And finally, I think to help students be more resilient, they need faculty who know about and who use inclusive pedagogies. And those are, of course, there's a huge umbrella of inclusive teaching and learning. What we need to do is provide more opportunities for faculty to learn about those pedagogical strategies, and then to have incentive structures that reward faculty for using those inclusive pedagogies. And of course, by that we mean ways to create learning environments and course structures that allow all students to succeed, particularly those who may be from secondary institutions where they had access to fewer resources and fewer opportunities. So inclusive pedagogies are in part meant to mitigate some of those opportunity gaps. And when you're in a crisis, all of that gets magnified. And the degree then to which we can help faculty develop some of these other pedagogical strategies that are meant to address some of those inequities, the better we can help our students to navigate this new pathway for themselves. And resilient faculty, the kind of final part of this equation, they need support and resources from the university. Again, this is not something an individual should feel like they need to take the burden on themselves to do all this work. The university has to be responsible as well for supporting faculty and giving them resources in order for folks to be more resilient. They need opportunities to learn about the engaging pedagogies that we're about to talk about that are agnostic to modality. They need community so they can talk about what's going on and what's going well, what's not going well with other colleagues who are going through the same thing. I think one of the things that we found in surveys that we gave to both our students and our faculty is that many of them felt isolated. For students, isolation is detrimental to learning. We know that social presence, cognitive presence is a very important element. It's a predictor of success in online courses. But faculty too. Faculty felt very isolated, not just from their students. You know, lots of reports of, you know, I can't get any comments in class, or no, these students aren't emailing me back. So not just isolation from their students, but isolation from each other. I talked to many faculty in the spring who felt as if they were islands unto themselves. And that is an obstacle to resilience, to self-care, to mental health for both students and faculty. And so any framework that is stressing resiliency has to also keep in mind the students and the faculty who are at the center of that learning work. So how is the model that I'm talking about here, resilient pedagogy, creating courses that are resistant to disruption, how is that different from contingency planning, which was kind of the dominant model by default in the spring? I've heard this referred to as the ripcord model. You know, you got to pull the ripcord to have the parachutes, right? And that kind of contingency planning is sort of something that occurs immediately when a crisis comes up, right? It's not something that happens at the design phase, which is really where resilient pedagogy comes in. Contingency planning would happen when the emergency occurs. And so it could potentially allow faculty to repurpose some of the material they had used in the spring for thinking about future planning, right? It feels more familiar, right? You don't have to, you can design the way you used to design, and then develop the contingency when an emergency pops up. But what drew me to the resilient pedagogy model was that what I witnessed in the spring were faculty who were doing 2 or 3 times the design work, putting in much more effort than they probably otherwise needed to, if we had the opportunity to design for emergencies from the very beginning. It was necessary in the spring. It's not necessary for this semester and semesters beyond to put in so much extra work. And by that, I mean, okay, in a contingency model, you say, here's a goal that I have. If I'm teaching face-to-face, here's what that looks like. If I have to go hybrid, here's what it would look like. If I have to move into synchronous online learning, here's what it would look like. And if I have to go to asynchronous, here's what it would look like. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of extra work that can be mitigated, ameliorated in many ways by thinking about those questions at the design stage. And of course, likely that some of those contingencies would be developed hurriedly in the face of disruption. Resilient pedagogy is different. It's a bit of work up front to reconceptualize the way we think about teaching and course design. But what it means is designing all aspects of a course one time at the beginning and using them regardless of the modality in which you're teaching. I'll say that a different way, and I'm going to give a few examples in a second. But it means designing the elements of a course one time so that you can use those elements regardless of what modality you're teaching in. And so in general, if I'm teaching hybrid and I find out that I need to quarantine the next day, I can still use the material that I have developed for students, the assignments, the activities that I had developed for them, because I was already designing agnostic to modality. I was already thinking that students would be doing this work regardless of where they were and what environment they were learning in. I think, and I think that this has been borne out a little bit, this leads to a more engaging student experience, particularly for those in synchronous or asynchronous remote courses, because you're thinking about engagement up front. How do I want my students to engage with the learning experience? How do I want them to make meaning from this work? And I'm thinking about that through the lens of, okay, no matter where my students are or where I'm teaching them, I need them to do this type of work, this level of engagement in order to advance the goals of the class. Resilient pedagogy responds to the changes in the face-to-face experience. And one thing we know from those who are currently teaching face-to-face is that this is a very different experience than teaching face-to-face has been in the past. People are in masks. It's hard to hear. It's hard to have discussions. It's because people are socially distanced. You can't do the same kind of group work or small group discussions that you've done in the past because people can't, group up together. And so resilient pedagogy responds to this too, because people are doing the work outside of class, and you come in and you can augment that work, but you don't necessarily need to rely on the same parameters that we used to have, 100 years ago back in February for face-to-face environments. Right? And finally, and importantly, and I've been stressing this a lot, the resilient pedagogy model allows for a seamless transition in the face of disruptions. But the point I want to make about this is, although we're talking about COVID-related disruptions right now, the reason, one of the reasons I was drawn to this particular model is because it doesn't only work for COVID-related disruptions. It can work well for disruptions of any kind. And so I'm thinking back to my Houston days and the Hurricane Harvey again. A resilient model could work for that kind of disruption as well. Weather-related disruptions, illness disruptions, all kinds of things that may otherwise disrupt the semester. So I want to give a couple of examples of what this means, or how to design in a way that is agnostic to modality, where students are doing the work regardless of the learning environment. So what I have here is a screenshot from Edpuzzle, which is it's a website where you can either upload your own video or it integrates with YouTube, so you can find content in videos if you'd like. And you can build in questions, analytical questions that students need to answer before the video will move forward. Edpuzzle isn't the only one that does this, of course. It's just the one that I happen to use the most, but there are other examples of this type of thing. So what I would do in designing this resiliently is I would upload my video, and this is a college level lecture on photosynthesis. Periodically in the video, I would build in the kinds of questions that you see on the right. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm pretending that I know what a chloroplast is in order to make my point. And then they are answering those questions, and you can be assessing their answers, their level of analysis, their level of interpretation. And they're doing this work the night before, or as the prep for wherever you're going to, whatever learning environment you're teaching them in. So if I'm face-to-face, my students are still doing this the night before. If I'm hybrid, same. Synchronous, same. They're still doing this work. This is what we mean by resilient design, because if I am teaching face-to-face and I find out that the institution has closed or I have to quarantine, something like that, I simply say to students, I email and say, okay, you're still doing the same activity tonight, but instead of meeting in the classroom, we're meeting on Zoom tomorrow. Or instead of meeting on Zoom, if I'm teaching synchronously and have a disruption, we're gonna do ask and answer some questions in the discussion forum. But they're still, this is the core, they're still doing this same work regardless of where we're meeting. Now, that's different than the way many think about course design and assignment and activity design. It would have been much more common for me in past semesters to say, okay, let's do the reading, and then we'll have a discussion and some short lectures the next time we meet. That is the kind of thing that is, that's the kind of approach though, that is very open to disruption. If most of the planning is about what you'll do in the class time, a disruption will create a kind of chaos to that particular mode of planning. This model, the resilient model, allows us to think about the work happening when we're not together, and then augmenting that work wherever we happen to be together the next day, right? We hope that there's continuity in where we're meeting, but this is a plan that allows us to shift if we need to. Here's another example. This is much closer to my own background in the humanities. This is a tool called Hypothesis. Again, it's one of many of its kind. It is a social collaboration and annotation tool. And it allows you to take any PDF or any text that you can find online and import it. And what you see here is it allows you to annotate lines, to ask questions. As you see on the right-hand side of your screen, I've built this question into one of the lines. Why is this line important for understanding the poem as a whole? So again, what I would be doing before, in a pre-COVID time, I would have assigned the road not taken the night before. Students would have come in and we would have discussed that poem. I'm flipping that, and this is in many ways a flipped classroom, so I'm using that term intentionally. But I'm flipping that model for resilient design and asking students to do a lot of analytical and interpretive work before we get together, so that I can then augment that wherever I'm meeting them. And they can. The thing I love about Hypothesis is they can highlight lines, they can ask questions in the margins, they can answer my questions, they can comment on each other's questions and commentary, and it's all gathered in one place as a repository, a kind of repository for the work we did with that poem that students can go back to over time. And so this is another kind of easy example of the way we might conceptualize resilient design approaches. Now, I'm also aware that the two examples that I have shown you, one from STEM, one from the humanities, are the lowest hanging fruit, right? These are the easiest ways, I think, to conceptualize resilient design. There are disciplines out there that have teaching challenges that are more difficult to adapt, but not impossible to adapt. So for example, artists teaching studio classes. How do you teach ceramics if you're not all together with a kiln? That's a big question, right? And so one thing I had to do when I was trying to pull our summer programming together was go out and find resources, ways to answer that question. How do you do that? There are other, science labs that are harder to do in this model, but not impossible. There are many online simulations that are out there, and simulations have a long research history demonstrating their impact on student learning. So there are ways, even in the most challenging courses, to think about the development of those assignments and those labs and those courses through the lens of resilient design. So I want to move to some questions for you, a little bit of a workshop element. In order to do all of this, we first have to make a pretty significant leap as teachers. And that leap is both a psychological and a logistical one. And it is a reconceptualization of the teaching and learning relationship. So for example, many faculty that I know had to clear one really important obstacle in order to begin to think about, okay, well, how am I going to do this if I can't be face-to-face with my students? And that was a kind of grieving process for the way it used to be. That this has been, and I've observed it not just at my university, but across the board in American higher ed, a grieving for what the classroom used to be, what I loved most about teaching in a classroom, or what I loved most about hybrid, and thinking through a kind of acceptance of that. Okay, it's different now. And that is the most important first step for thinking about a resilient pedagogy model, because there's a kind of letting go of the way it used to be in order to imagine new possibilities for the way to design these activities and assignments and modules so that students can do them regardless of where they are. And so in thinking through that first step, we need to begin by thinking about the interactions that shape our teaching. So what I'd like to do is to give you just a few minutes to think about some of these guiding questions. If this is the starting point for resilient pedagogy, how can you yourself think through these questions for the courses that you are teaching? So I'm going to read the questions and then just give you a couple of minutes to think about it and maybe sketch some notes. What do you value most about the interactions you have with students in your classroom, whatever it is? If you teach online or hybrid or face-to-face, it's your classroom. I want you to think about what those interactions, what you value most about those interactions. How might you imagine cultivating similar interactions if you're not in the classroom or in your space, whatever that space is for you? And how can you utilize some of the resilient strategies so that students can benefit from those interactions regardless of the learning environment they find themselves in? So for these, what you're imagining is students may need to access your course through an environment that is not the one that you are predominantly teaching in. And you have to think about how can you have the same kinds of interactions with them, even if you're not in the same place that you used to be, right? And what is meaningful to you about those interactions? So I'd like to give you just a few minutes to think about that. And then we'll give an opportunity for folks to maybe raise their hands and give us some of the ideas that you came up with. So let's just jot down some notes for maybe 3 minutes. We'll come back together 1:40 or 2:47 your time and chat about some of these. Okay, I know that wasn't a lot of time, but maybe enough to get the ball rolling a little bit. So I'd like to just invite those who might be willing to use your little raise hand feature, and our moderators will unmute you so you can give us some feedback on this. What are some of the interactions that you value most, and how might you do that if you're in an environment different from one that you're used to? So. Looks like Marianne Woods has her hand up.
I think I value most the student input and the discussions I have with students.
Great, very good. And how could you think about how can you capture the essence of that if you're in an environment that might not be the one that you had planned on?
Well, if it was online, I can have discussion forums. Mm-hmm. If I am in an environment where I can have different sections that may be online, where students can discuss amongst themselves the questions and then come back to the group as a whole.
That's great. Excellent ideas. Good, thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, Joshua.
Hi.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. It's just not the interaction that I would like to have with the students. It's kind of interaction that how much I can implement among these students, because what I think is students, they must have the ability, and they do learn interacting with one another. So of course, the discussion board is one of the way to initiate that kind of interaction. But I think giving a student a kind of an assignments that so that they can make a team and interact with one another offline, and then do that assignment interactively, and then as needed, they can then come to the instructor in order to get the responses back to them. So I have utilized this practice, and it has been extremely successful, and students, they do appreciate these assignments.
Yes, that is a really great point. And I think possibly one of the pieces of feedback I've given most during this time has been, synchronously, asynchronously, or if you're teaching kind of in multiple environments at once, as a lot of people are, to form teams with students as early as possible, to give them the kinds of assignments that you're talking about where they can build trust with each other, and then to keep those teams consistent over the course of the semester so they have some stability and can also, at the same time, be drawing on those social interactions that are so important to learning. So I'm really glad you brought this up, because it's not just our interactions with students, it's students' interactions with each other. So that's a great point. Another really great strategy that one of my colleagues uses for that social interaction, and this is especially good for asynchronous students or, again, across different environments. She uses Google Docs quite a lot for collaborative exercises, so that students kind of, no matter where they are, can be collaborating on one project, one problem, one question together. Now she uses it for her hybrid courses, where there's some people in person, some people online synchronous, and some people asynchronous at the same time. Yet the students feel as if they are all working together, no matter where they are, because they are in that Google Doc, sometimes at the same time, but even that kind of asynchronous collaboration still draws on those social interactions that are so important. So thank you. I think we have time for one more, and I see Carlos Hernandez's hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Thanks for this opportunity. One of the things that I like most about working with the students is to get a sense of who they are, what are their interests and experiences, what they bring to class. Because in reality, I teach online, asynchronous, and the focus is on making them work together, interact with each other. And as you pointed in the beginning, you can tell by how much people participate in class, how much the level of motivation they have from the start. So it really makes a big difference in terms of how much they put and get from the course. Talking, for example, about the collaborations, Google Docs, and groups projects, and finding that some of them like it, some of them don't, and this comes from their experiences in the classrooms when they have difficulties working with other people. And now, because of the issues we're having, sometimes there have been problems. I have experienced, of course, interruptions myself. I'm in Puerto Rico, and I have problems with the power grid since Hurricane Maria a few years back. So I'm seeing this in several times with different students. And one of the things that I think it works for them is to, of course, make sure that they have access to all the information ahead of time, that even if I cannot log in or they cannot log in, that they can keep working until they get back access to the platform, and then they can come back and do whatever they have and then submit it. The key issue here is, for me, is that they do not fall behind. And even if they have to talk to me instead of other students because they cannot have access, as I said, I want to keep them involved, and do not forget that they have to put the time, because it's easier to fall behind online. And also, one thing that I try to do sometimes is that even if it's not for the same class, some of the discussions and key points that have come up in previous courses, I want to record them and have them available for the students, just in case they cannot participate in an active discussion, either in a discussion forum or in other way in the class. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that. And I really appreciate, again, your emphasis there on having students build those connections with each other and continue to work together, even in asynchronous courses, right? And you know, people have been doing amazing work building social presence in asynchronous courses for a long time. So thank you for that. Great, and I hope that that process or some of these questions have been useful. I think as a starting point for a course design process that places resiliency at the center, this is our first and in some ways our most important step. What do we find meaningful about teaching and those interactions, and how do we conceptualize them in a variety of different learning environments? The next step then would be to think about the learning goals. So what we're really doing here, even as we're focused on resiliency, is we're utilizing a course design approach that I'm sure many of you know of already, called backward design. And I have an illustration here from one of the best books on teaching and course design that I know of, Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. And they articulate, they didn't come up with the concept, but they popularized it. They articulate a model they call backward design, which is set in opposition to traditional course design. So in traditional course design, the way, we're not really taught how to do these things in grad school. So many of us are just kind of finding our way through the course design process when we start. And traditionally, that often looks like, okay, well, what am I going to teach? What's the content I'm going to teach? And then working from the content out. The backward design approach begins with the end in mind. That's why we call it backward. We're beginning with the end. And what I mean by that, we begin with what we want our students to achieve at the end of the semester. So what are our learning goals? What are, as you can see in this graphic, what are the desired results? Where do we want students to be at the end? And then take a step back. What evidence do we need from students to determine how far they're progressing on those goals? And then we say, once we determine what that evidence would look like, then we can plan the learning experiences, the content, the instruction. And so what we're doing here is using this model, but focusing on resiliency. So already, we certainly haven't thought about content or anything that we're teaching. First, we have thought about how are we going to develop meaningful interactions no matter what environment we're teaching in. And then we have to go to our learning goals. What do we want those students to achieve? And how will we be able to both implement and achieve these learning goals in such a way that if we have to shift into a different environment, that we can be sure that our goal will remain consistent and the work toward that goal will not have to undergo much change for the sake of the consistency of our students' learning. So I have some questions here. Well, I'm not gonna do the same thing that we did the last time. I just wanted to lay them out so that you could see a kind of beginning process for thinking about learning goals through the lens of resilient pedagogy. So choosing a class that you might teach, and this is a process you can use in your course design strategies. Choosing a class you teach next term, identifying 3 learning goals you have for students. Now I'm calling them learning goals. Other people call them learning outcomes, learning objectives. There's some who make differentiate between those terms. For ease, I don't necessarily, although I can acknowledge that there are slight difference in terms there. But what I simply mean is, what are your goals? What are your goals for student learning? So identifying 3 of those goals, selecting a goal, and choosing something that you would have done before. So in other iterations of this class, I often give this activity. Having chose that activity, then sketch out ways to make that activity more resilient in design. So this is essentially a way to think about backward design and building resiliency into it. So I can send along these slides to Tammy and Sarah and make them available for attendees, because this is really a process that informs the way we think about course design. Because we start up here with interactions and goals, and then we work our way down through the rest of the decisions that we need to make to build a resilient course. As you approach the end of the process in the backward design model, that's when you start to think about content. And I've chosen to take some time on this particular point because I think there are circumstances that have arisen due to the pandemic that affect our decisions that we make about how much content we can expect students to master over the course of a semester. So I have another graphic here from Understanding by Design. As you can see, I'm a big fan. I'm in no way getting an endorsement for that book, but I just really love it. I think it's a great way to approach these questions. And so part of the content decision that I think we have to make in this new landscape of higher ed is how much can we cover versus how much can students reasonably learn. And the questions that came up more and more in student responses, student feedback that we got at the end of the spring semester were having to do with being able to manage all of the different learning platforms, all the different technology tools that they may or may not have been familiar with, all of the different the changes, all the changes that were made to both their assignments and the learning delivery. And on top of that, all of the emotional and psychological consequences of living through these turbulent times, right? And so that actually has an impact on what we refer to as cognitive load, which is essentially our brains, the limits of how much our brains can manage and still have room for doing cognitive work. And we all have those limits. And what I'm suggesting here is that the living and learning in these times adds a dimension of cognitive load that may not have, there may have been little bits of it, but it may not have been this dramatic in the past. And when you pair that with the kind of anxiety that we know that has been elevated for many of our students in fears about getting sick or their family getting sick or losing a job or, all the many different things that are happening right now. You pair that together, pair those together, and what you find is students have less capacity than we might assume for covering the same amount of material that we would have asked them to tackle before the pandemic. And so we really need to juggle those two, balance those two ideas together and think through our content decisions, our coverage decisions. I'm going to give you a specific example. The surveys that I keep talking about, again, we gave one to students and one to faculty at the University of Mississippi. And there was one finding that we found extraordinarily interesting, and it ties directly into this topic. The question on both surveys was about workload. And it was essentially, did the workload, did the course maintain the same workload? Was there more work after the transition, or was the workload less after the transition? In the faculty survey, pretty much, I think all of the responses, were either we kept the workload the same or we reduced the workload. There were a couple, a very few who added work. I don't know why, but most of the responses were we kept it the same or we reduced it. However, if you looked at the student surveys, what they reported were the courses either stayed the same or they felt like there was more work. And in trying to reconcile those two responses, our first thought is, well, there's a lot of possible reasons for that. But our second thought, it was that one of the things influencing the students' responses is probably this particular issue of cognitive load, that for them, even if the workload remained the same, it felt like it was more, right? And that's because of how much they're juggling and how many resources they can allocate for that cognitive work. So practically speaking, as we design resilient courses, as we design courses for what is happening right now, it forces us to make certain decisions about our content that we need to cover. Do we actually have to cover A through Z? What is most important? Where are our priorities? And I have this graphic here because it's a tool that I use in course design workshops that I give to help think through content decisions. In the middle, you see big ideas and core tasks. These would be things that we would keep, content, ideas, concepts that we would keep no matter what. Like they would never be cut in any circumstance. The middle concentric circle, important to know and do. These are things that are likely to remain in the course, that are at the top of our priority list. But if we get pressed, for example, many of our universities have shorter fall semesters. So if we get pressed, they could potentially get cut depending on how we have prioritized them in terms of student learning. And then there's this outer concentric circle worth being familiar with. These are things that are pretty cool to know and understand, but not necessary, not essential. And so these are on the front lines of getting cut if we need to make those decisions. There's a really great tool that I often recommend. It was developed at Rice and is now housed at Wake Forest. It's a course workload estimator, and you kind of plug in all the numbers of the things you're assigning, and it spits out at you the number of hours you're asking students to work outside of class time. It can help us make some of these decisions, but the moral of the story is that what we used to ask of them may not be as possible anymore. Now, I'm also aware that there are many disciplines where there are accreditation standards and board exams and things like that. In that case, it's not necessarily a question of cutting content. It's a question of how much time you give to each bit of content, right? So it's a slightly different calculus, but it's the same basic idea. So these are all the ways that I wanted to kind of think through the beginnings of conceptualizing a resilient course design process. As I mentioned at the beginning, and this is the same slide I used at the beginning, this is only one element of resilient pedagogy. Sadly, not enough time in our hour and more together to really dive into how to help students, how to give them the opportunities to learn how to be better online learners. Lots of possibilities for that, as are the possibilities for how to help faculty develop the pedagogical strategies that can mitigate some of the effects of this particular crisis on students. But I wanted to get the ball rolling to give us a framework for a new way of thinking about how we can make our courses more adaptable and flexible in the face of uncertainty. I wanted to end, though, with what I think is an equally important question here. And that is, how do you move from acknowledging that a model seems like the right fit to actually scaling programming so as many faculty at an institution or in a particular program have access to that model and to programming about that model as possible? Because it's one thing for old Josh Eiler to say, hey, that resilient pedagogy, that seems like it would work. And it's another thing to move from that to actually giving people the tools to utilize that model for their own courses. So I just wanted to end by talking a bit about how we did that. How did we scale that particular model and the programming at the University of Mississippi? First, we wanted to lead with our values. This was really important for our own institutional culture. Faculty autonomy is a priority. So whatever we did, we knew that it could not be mandatory, or it could not feel like a kind of template or a checklist of any kind. It had to be authentic. It had to emerge from within the disciplines and move outward rather than go from the top down. So we decided to adapt a model that we saw was being employed at Wake Forest University And what they were doing was they were bringing together a learning community of faculty to think about course design. There was a select number of faculty from each department who attended I think theirs was a 4-week-long learning community with a group of people that included their teaching center. And then those faculty went back to their departments and ran a smaller, shorter version of that same learning community for their faculty, for their disciplinary colleagues. So that model really resonated with me because it was a way to do a couple of things. Number one, it was a way to really foster a kind of collaboration from colleague to colleague within the department. It was also a way to distribute the work to and the programming as far as possible, right? Because the other models for this kind of work, one model would be to hire a lot of instructional designers. That was out for us. Another model is to have a centralized course design institute. But what I have found in my years working in teaching centers is that even the most popular, well-attended course design institute only draws the people who you normally see. We call it the choir, preaching to the choir. It only draws those folks. And we really needed to spread out much more than just the people who normally attend. So this also had the potential to scale the programming as well. So we adapted that for our own institutional context. We had asked our chairs to nominate 2 faculty leaders from each department. Again, it was optional, but most departments did this. Then our Keep Teaching team facilitated an 8-day learning community on resilient pedagogy with those faculty leaders. They, with our help, then designed a shorter discipline-specific version of that for their colleagues, and they facilitated that with support from us. And then it was the faculty's, in the faculty's hands to keep that design work going. Those faculty leaders are still working within their departments, the first point of contact for any questions that come up. We needed to focus on the capacity of the people who are delivering the program. We needed to focus on how are we going to incentivize the faculty leaders, and we came up with a compensation model that fit for our context. And then we also needed to think about accountability for departments. How did we make sure that the department level learning community worked and went and was successful? And how did we carry that work forward? So this was our answer. It's not the only answer, but I did want to talk about this step, because without this step, getting it into as many faculty hands as possible, it's hard to use any model, including resilient pedagogy, as a springboard for moving a university in a direction that maximizes student learning at the same time as it helps to minimize the faculty workload. And that ultimately was our goal. It was a reason I was drawn to the resilient pedagogy model from the outset, and it informed the way that we designed programming to help that reach as many faculty as possible. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Q&A. Again, you can raise your hand and ask the question, and I'm happy to chat about all of this. Okay, question. Have I used Microsoft Teams with students? I have not used Microsoft Teams, though I know faculty who have used it. And honestly, I think it's very useful for breakout rooms, working together in small groups, encouraging that small group discussion and that collaboration. I'm most familiar with Zoom and the ways to use Zoom for that. We're largely a Zoom campus, though some do use Microsoft Teams on campus. But I think it has a lot of possibilities for encouraging some of that social presence and social interaction that we were talking about earlier. Okay, I see another question here. What kind of evaluation might you imagine to assess the success for faculty and students of these redeveloped courses? That's a really good question. So I'm guessing here that the question is rooted in kind of a end of semester evaluation, that sort of thing. And we've just launched a midterm survey that folks can use for kind of a check-in with their students to see how it's going. The evaluation, we're not changing necessarily any of the questions on the end of semester evaluation, but one thing we are doing is asking the chairs to submit, the chairs who nominated faculty leaders for that learning community, to submit a report at the end of the semester as to how successful they felt the process went, and with evidence to support that. So they knew the people who were involved in their learning communities, and they can speak to the feedback that they saw from students and from their faculty as to how the redesigns went. And there's a lot of room to grow in this particular area. We were hyper focused on getting the programming up and running and getting getting people, helping people get the ball rolling. And these are questions that I think that we need to continue to think carefully about, but that's the system that we've put in place for now. Okay, another question. What are some ways to foster resilience in learning and help them to be more adaptive in changes that might happen during the semester? So I'm guessing here we're talking about how to foster resilience for the students. And there are lots of different ways that we can do this, I think. Importantly, social presence and instructor presence are absolutely critical in helping students develop this resilience in learning. And the instructor presence, they need to see you or hear from you as often as possible. Frequent communication that goes beyond just, here's what we're doing this week, to check-ins with, how are things going? How are you doing? Frequent check-ins like that. Frequent use of what we call classroom assessment techniques, there are lots of different ones, but some of them include minute papers, or what folks call exit tickets at the end of each class, a student asking students, what do you feel like you have a good handle on after this class session? What are you still confused by? What are questions that you have? Ways to continually involve them in the learning community. And then augmenting that with an attention to the social interaction that we were talking about, the social presence. So, putting them in those teams, giving them group assignments, asking them to check in with each other so that no one kind of gets lost along the way. Building into the work of the environment, whatever it is, synchronous or asynchronous, ways for that collaboration to happen. Now, beyond that, pointing students in the right direction to the resources that I was talking about earlier about how to learn effectively online, other university resources that they might need for some of those emotional, psychological components of this process. I think that's equally important. Finally, I'll say flexibility on the part of the instructor. That's the same sorts of policies we may have had pre-pandemic may not be conducive to this kind of resilience in learning that we're hoping to foster at this moment. Okay, good. What is the best way to handle a request for a letter of recommendation or reference when we may not have met our students in person? Okay, that's a good question. I think, some of those strategies might be the same that you would do if you were to have met them in person. For example, I know a lot of people, myself included, when we write letters of recommendation, ask students to submit past work, like the good examples that they feel represent them well from past work that they submitted for me. And kind of others go even further. They have kind of a list of questions that they ask students to answer to get a better sense of how to position the letter. So that might be the same, and I would encourage those kinds of efforts. But in this environment, maybe setting up a Zoom conference, a half-an-hour session to talk to the student, meet them, talk to them, talk about your expectations for letters of recommendation, get to know them through some questions. That might be a way that you can kind of bridge the gap a little bit. Okay, how do you monitor, assess student participation in group or team projects, especially if that interaction is happening outside of the class framework? Okay, I'm going to break those into two because I think student participation in class is one thing, but now that I look at it again, it looks like you're specifically asking about participation in these group projects. So even in any group projects, certainly in asynchronous environments, but really any of them, accountability is a must. And so assessing this participation is something that I know a lot of people wrestle with. Honestly, there are a couple ways to go about this. Some are more or less formalized. But one element of this could be peer and self-evaluation of their role in the group. And so I know a lot of folks who ask students to submit, in addition to the project, their assessment of their own role and their assessment of the other group members' roles in the project. And that is a portion of the grade that the instructor takes that feedback into account for a portion of the grade. So that level of accountability can really help monitor with the monitoring and assessment of the participation. Others are even more formal. They use, a lot of engineers and other folks in the sciences use a tool called CATME, which formalizes the assessment process for group work. It assigns points for certain kinds of activities and builds in reflections along the way for how folks are participating in that work. But I think formalized assessment and feedback processes are really essential for maintaining that accountability, especially if it's happening outside of class. Can I repeat the name of the resource I used when discussing the Robert Frost poem? It is Hypothesis with a period between the S and the I. It's a Chrome extension tool, so you can access it on any search engine, but you'll need Chrome to really make the best use out of it. But I really like it. Another option that's very similar, although they're free versions of Hypothesis and Perusall, which is this other option. But Perusall gets less free much more quickly than Hypothesis does. So I tend to use Hypothesis more than Perusall, Perusall, but that does a very similar kind of thing.
Joshua, can you talk a little bit more about maybe some of the dissonance people may feel about the concept that you talked about with cognitive load balance and the need to sort of, people are learning differently now, even if they were experienced online, asynchronous teachers and students in the past, how that's different now with that need to still maintain high standards. So sometimes when we talk about those things, people will say, oh, but we don't want to dumb down our class. So how do you maintain that high standard while at the same time providing a little bit more balance of that cognitive load?
That's a really great question. And I think it's a question that's on the minds of every faculty member right now. And it's addressing, the issue of rigor and academic standards, and how do we balance having those standards with being more flexible and adaptable and attending to, many of the student needs that we've been talking about, specifically cognitive load. So first, the answer that I typically give about this is we have to really step back and assess what we mean by our standards and what we value and prioritize with academic work. So if a standard had been that students need to memorize X number of things, what is the value of that? This is one of the things that this moment is confronting all of us with. What what do we actually value as educators, and is what we had prioritized before meaningful for student learning? So really assessing and prioritizing our standards for the class. And then, you know, I think it's possible to move from that, that kind of assessment on our own, that sort of metacognitive work for us, to say, okay, well, if this is what I'm prioritizing, is there a way that I can design a new activity or a new assignment that's going to perhaps be less taxing on the cognitive load and more tied to the needs of students at this moment? And I'll give you a really great example of this. I was talking to a faculty member in engineering who usually gives really challenging, in-depth final exams, but because of the issue that you just raised, Tammy, decided not to give a final exam this semester and utilize a portfolio, which you know, in some disciplines is kind of old hat, but in engineering, not so much. I mean, that's a pretty progressive way of thinking about assessing the semester's learning outcomes. And so we talked about what might go into that portfolio, but it was this very issue that she was responding to. I certainly need to maintain my standards for a lot of different reasons, accreditation being one of them. But I want to develop the kinds of assignments that will demonstrate that students have mastered those standards and achieve those goals, but in ways that free up some of that cognitive load, so that they don't have the pressure, the stress, and the memorization taxation of an exam, but they can still show and demonstrate what they've learned through the assignments and the reflection that's in the portfolio. So I think once we prioritize, it becomes reassessing the actual assignments that we're giving and asking ourselves if there are other, maybe non-traditional or other kinds of assignments that we can give them to do that work.
That looks like it's going to wrap up the Q&A, I believe, but wow, that was great. Thank you again, Dr. Eiler, for kicking off the 2020 Faculty Summit. We all appreciate you clarifying an area which we can all relate to and experience in this moment. For those who don't know me, my name is Jacob Felderstein, and I am the Training Specialist in the Instructional Research Center for the AAP. I just wanted to provide a couple of quick reminders. We'll provide both a short summit survey and a survey that follows up each session that we will urge you to complete. Also, we have 2 great sessions to look out for tomorrow. At 1 p.m. is right on finding time for your own work. And at 5 p.m. Eastern Time is using engagement strategies to coax the best from students. The email invitation can be used to register. And again, thank you, Dr. Eiler. I got a lot out of that, and I bet a lot of people did, and that was really good. And thank you again for joining us, and we hope you all enjoy the summit and the upcoming sessions.
Thanks to you all. Thanks very much.